Silence has a sound. It is the sound of wind moving through empty streets, the sound of birds nesting in palaces, the sound of footsteps that no longer echo back. Across the world, cities once alive with voices, trade, ceremony, and belief now stand abandoned. Stone by stone they remain, yet the people who built them are gone, not erased, not destroyed in a single night, but vanished from the places they once ruled. This is not the story of a single collapse. This is the story of a pattern. Again and again, human civilization reaches astonishing heights, engineering wonders, mastering landscapes, bending nature to its will. And again, something breaks, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly, often quietly. No firestorms, no final battles, just departure. This is the story of the silent cities. Before we begin, understand this. Civilizations do not die the way movies show us. They do not always fall to invasion or disaster. More often, they unravel. Pressure builds. Systems strain, choices compound. And one day, people stop repairing the roads, stop carving the stones, stop writing the dates. The silence begins long before the city is empty. Our story starts more than 4,000 years ago in a land shaped by rivers. The Indus River does not roar like the Nile. It shifts, it wanders, it changes its mind. Along its banks rose one of the most advanced civilizations of the ancient world. Vast cities laid out on precise grids. Streets aligned with mathematical intent, homes built from standardized bricks, each identical in size. Drainage systems so advanced that many would not be matched again for thousands of years. This society left no grand statues of kings, no towering pyramids, no inscriptions proclaiming conquest or divine rule. Instead, it left order. At its height, millions lived across hundreds of settlements. Trade networks stretched for thousands of kilometers. Weights and measures were uniform across the region. Craftsmanship was refined. Urban planning was meticulous. And then without war, without fire, without ruins filled with bodies, the cities emptied. No smashed walls, no mass graves, no signs of invasion. People simply left. Archaeologists once searched desperately for a single dramatic explanation. An earthquake, a conquering army, a sudden flood, but the soil told a quieter story. Rivers shifted their courses. Rain patterns changed. Agricultural yields declined. Trade slowed. Urban centers lost their advantage. When cities no longer fed people, people no longer fed cities. There is something unsettling about this disappearance. No final scream, no last stand, just the slow decision repeated by thousands of families to move elsewhere. A civilization advanced enough to plan entire cities, yet unable to control the climate that sustained them. The silence did not arrive all at once, it crept in. And this would not be the last time. More than 2,000 years later, across an ocean, another civilization would carve time itself into stone. In the dense jungles of Central America, towering temples rose above the canopy. Their steps aligned with the movements of the sun, the moon, the planets. Mathematics flourished. Astronomy reached staggering precision. Writing captured dynasties, rituals, wars, and cosmic cycles. These were not isolated villages. They were powerful city-states, each competing, each expanding, each hungry for prestige. Stone monuments recorded dates with absolute confidence. Kings proclaimed their victories. Gods demanded offerings. The cities grew taller, denser, more complex. And then something happened that no inscription explains. Dates stopped. In city after city, carved calendars end abruptly. Construction halts. Palaces fall into disrepair. Reservoirs dry. Populations decline. The jungle reclaims the streets. For centuries, outsiders believed the people themselves vanished, that the jungle swallowed an entire civilization whole. This was never true. The descendants survived, their languages survived, their traditions survived. What vanished were the cities. Evidence now suggests a perfect storm, droughts lasting decades, soil exhausted by intensive farming, forests cleared too aggressively, political rivalries escalating into constant warfare. The system had no flexibility. When rain failed, there was no margin. When food declined, conflict rose. When trust collapsed, leaders lost legitimacy. Power depended on divine favor, and when the skies went silent, so did belief. The lesson is chilling. Advanced knowledge does not guarantee resilience. These cities did not fall to ignorance, they fell to imbalance. Northward, in a land of red stone and wide skies, another silence was forming. Cliff dwellings carved into sheer rock faces. Multi-story structures tucked beneath overhangs, vast ceremonial centers aligned to celestial events, roads stretching across deserts without written maps. This society thrived in a harsh environment through cooperation and precision. Water was life, corn was survival, social cohesion was essential. Then came drought, not a single bad year, but decades of drying skies. Crops failed, game declined, trees vanished faster than they could regrow. Communities adapted at first, they stored food. They shifted settlements, they reorganized leadership, but adaptation has limits. Eventually, families left ancestral homes that had been occupied for generations. Entire cities were abandoned, not in panic, but in sequence. Hearths cold, tools left behind, footprints fading into dust. The silence here was not defeat, it was choice. Survival meant moving on. And yet, standing before these empty dwellings today, carved into cliffs like memories in stone, one cannot escape the question, how fragile is permanence? Across the ocean in Southeast Asia, a city of water ruled an empire. Canals, reservoirs, and spillways formed a vast hydraulic machine. Rainwater was captured, stored, redirected. Rice fields flourished. Population soared. This was urbanism on an unprecedented scale, arguably the largest pre-industrial city the world had ever known. But complexity cuts both ways. When rainfall patterns shifted, the system strained. Floods overwhelmed canals, droughts left reservoirs dry, repairs became constant. Maintenance became overwhelming, political pressures mounted, rivals attacked, trade routes shifted. The city that once mastered water became trapped by it. Infrastructure designed for stability became a liability in chaos. Gradually, elites relocated. Administrative centers moved. The heart of the empire stopped beating. Temples remained, towers stood, but the city hollowed out. Nature returned not as a conqueror, but as an inheritor. Now consider the most isolated society of all. A small island, finite resources, no neighbors, no escape. Here stone giants rose, massive statues carved and transported without metal, without wheels, without beasts of burden. Each one representing ancestors, power, identity. Trees were cut to move them. Forests disappeared, soil eroded, birds vanished, food systems collapsed. Social order fractured, monument building ceased. And then came outsiders, bringing disease, enslavement, devastation. The silence here is often simplified into a cautionary tale, but the truth is more complex. Environmental stress met cultural pressure. External contact delivered the final blow. Isolation amplified every mistake. Across continents and centuries, the pattern repeats. Environmental stress, overextension, rigid systems, loss of adaptability. These civilizations were not foolish. They were brilliant. They solved the problems of their time until the problems changed. And when they did, success became vulnerability. The silent cities are not warnings carved in stone. They are mirrors. They ask us a question that echoes across time. When the systems we depend on begin to strain, will we adapt, or will our cities too fall silent? Silence does not arrive without warning. It announces itself softly through smaller harvests, through postponed repairs, through leaders who speak more often of enemies than of solutions. It arrives when rituals continue but belief thins, when monuments grow taller yet foundations weaken. The cities do not know they are dying. The people do not wake one morning and decide this is the end. They simply adapt again and again until adaptation itself is exhausted. To understand how civilizations vanish, we must abandon the idea of collapse as a single moment. What we are really witnessing is a process, pressure applied over time, resisted until resistance becomes impossible. And nowhere is this more visible than in the systems civilizations build to protect themselves. Every complex society relies on invisible agreements. Farmers trust that water will arrive. Merchants trust that roads will remain safe. Citizens trust that leaders will manage scarcity fairly. Priests promise that gods will respond. When these agreements hold, cities grow. When they fracture, silence follows. Consider what happens when a drought lasts not 1 year but 10. At first there are reserves, granaries open, rituals intensify, leaders assure the people that the gods are watching. When the drought continues, trade compensates, food is imported, taxes rise, labor increases, but eventually the math stops working. Food shortages create unrest, elites hoard resources, inequality becomes visible. Faith in leadership erodes, not because leaders are weak, but because the system they inherited cannot solve the new problem. And when trust collapses, people stop investing in the future. Why repair a road you may abandon? Why build a home you may leave? Why carve history into stone when tomorrow is uncertain? This is the moment when cities begin to hollow from the inside. Archaeologists often find a strange clue in abandoned cities, unfinished work, walls half built, stones left uncarved, temples planned but never completed. These are not signs of sudden destruction, they are signs of hesitation. Construction requires belief in continuity and stability in tomorrow. When belief falters, hands stop moving. This is why so many silent cities look frozen in time, not destroyed but paused forever. Another force haunts every fallen civilization: success. Success breeds growth, growth breeds complexity, complexity breeds dependence. The more a society succeeds, the more specialized it becomes. Farmers farm, engineers engineer, priests interpret the heavens, bureaucrats manage resources. This specialization is powerful but brittle. When systems are tightly coupled, failure spreads fast. A failed harvest no longer affects only farmers. It disrupts taxation, trade, religious legitimacy, political stability. The web trembles. In simpler societies, failure is localized. In complex ones, it cascades. The cities that vanished were not primitive. They were too advanced for their own resilience. Look closely at abandoned capitals and you'll notice something else. The countryside often outlasts the city. Rural settlements persist. Smaller towns adapt. People reorganize into less centralized forms. Civilization does not disappear. It changes shape. Urban silence does not mean human extinction. It means urban abandonment. This distinction matters. History is not a graveyard of people. It is a graveyard of systems. Why then do some societies survive transformation while others do not? The answer lies in flexibility. Civilizations that tolerate diversity of solutions, multiple crops, decentralized authority, adaptable infrastructure bend under pressure. Civilizations that demand uniformity, single water systems, rigid hierarchies, absolute belief break. Stone cities cannot move. People can. And when systems refuse to change, people choose motion. There is a haunting irony in how many silent cities were built to last forever, monuments designed to defy time, stones laid with cosmic precision, rituals meant to anchor eternity. Yet permanence was an illusion. The very act of fixing identity into stone made change harder. When leaders derive power from tradition, adaptation becomes heresy. When legitimacy depends on repeating the past, innovation looks like betrayal. Thus, civilizations often double down on what once worked, even as conditions transform. They pray harder, build bigger, enforce stricter control, but complexity cannot be commanded into resilience. One of the most dangerous moments in any civilization is when elites no longer experience the same risks as everyone else, when rulers have water while others thirst, when granaries fill for some and empty for others, when walls protect the center but not the edges. Archaeological layers reveal this imbalance clearly. Elite districts maintained, common areas neglected, public infrastructure decaying while palaces expand. This is the sound of trust eroding. Eventually, people disengage, not always through rebellion but through withdrawal. They stop contributing labor, stop paying tribute, stop believing the system represents them. Silence begins with disengagement. Another pattern emerges across vanished cities. Warning signs were visible for generations. Climate records show gradual change, not sudden catastrophe. Tree rings narrow year by year, lake sediments thin. Pollen records shift. The data was there, written in nature, but civilizations interpret reality through culture. If belief systems deny change, evidence becomes irrelevant. A drought may be explained as divine displeasure, a flood as ritual failure, a famine as moral weakness. When explanations protect ideology rather than guide adaptation, collapse accelerates. We often imagine ancient people as powerless before nature. This is false. Many silent cities demonstrate extraordinary ingenuity. Terraces carved into mountains, canals stretching for kilometers, reservoirs engineered with precision. The problem was not ignorance, the problem was scale. Solutions that work for centuries may fail at population levels never before attempted. Systems designed for stability struggle with volatility. And when climate variability increases, predictability, the foundation of civilization, disappears. There is also the burden of memory. Great civilizations remember their golden ages. They compare the present unfavorably to the past. Leaders promise restoration rather than transformation. Return us to greatness. Restore the old ways. Honor the ancestors. These are powerful messages. They unify people emotionally, but they anchor societies to conditions that no longer exist. History becomes a weight. As cities decline, art changes, monuments shrink, decoration simplifies, quality decreases. This is not cultural decay, it is triage. When survival is at stake, expression becomes pragmatic. Eventually, even pragmatic expression stops. Silence is not the absence of sound, it is the absence of intention. One of the most misunderstood aspects of vanished civilizations is time. Collapse is slow enough that no single generation sees it clearly. A child grows up in a world slightly diminished from their parents, but still functional. They adapt, their children adapt again. Only centuries later does the full arc become visible. By then, the city is empty. Why do we remain obsessed with these silent places? Because they resemble us. We recognize the ambition, the confidence, the belief in mastery. We see ourselves in the planners who thought bigger was better, in the engineers who trusted systems without backup, in the leaders who delayed hard choices because the present still worked barely. The ruins unsettle us because they were once solutions. And yet these stories are not only warnings, they are also evidence of survival. People endured, cultures transformed, knowledge migrated, traditions adapted. The silence of cities is not the end of humanity, it is the end of a particular way of organizing it. The question is not whether civilizations fall. The question is whether they learn before silence arrives. Modern societies often ask, what caused collapse? Ancient societies would ask a different question, what kept us going so long? The answer lies in cooperation, innovation, and belief. But belief must be flexible, because the greatest threat to any civilization is not disaster, it is the refusal to change when disaster evolves. Every silent city teaches the same lesson in a different language. Nature is not static. Resources are not infinite. Systems are not immortal. Stone remembers what people forget. As we walk through ruins today, we hear no voices, but the silence is crowded with meaning. It tells us that complexity demands humility. That success must be questioned. That permanence is earned through adaptation, not monumentality. And it leaves us with an uncomfortable thought. The greatest civilizations did not fall because they were weak. They fell because they were strong right up until the moment strength became rigidity. The silence did not arrive from outside. It grew from within. Silence, once it settles in a city, is patient. It does not rush. It does not announce victory. It waits. Grass grows between stones. Rain softens edges. Walls lean, then fall. What was once crowded becomes spacious. What was once sacred becomes scenery. But beneath that quiet surface lies something more disturbing than destruction: normalcy. For the people living through decline, the end never feels like the end. It feels like adjustment. And adjustment, repeated long enough, becomes acceptance. One of the greatest misconceptions about vanished civilizations is that their people knew they were witnessing collapse. They did not. They lived in a world where each generation inherited slightly fewer options, slightly less certainty, slightly more stress, and called it life. Taxes rose, labor demands increased, ceremonies multiplied, leaders promised renewal. From the inside, it looked like endurance. From the outside, we call it collapse. Imagine being a farmer near a great city at the height of its power. Your parents spoke of abundance, reliable rains, festivals that lasted days, leaders who distributed grain during hard times. Now imagine that same farmer decades later. Rain is unpredictable, granaries are guarded, festivals continue but feel hollow. Officials demand more labor, more tribute, more faith. You adapt, you plant different crops, you work longer hours, you pray harder. But one day you hear that a neighboring village has moved. Another soon follows, and the unthinkable becomes possible. Leaving a city is not a failure, it is a calculation. People leave when the cost of staying outweighs the uncertainty of going. This is the moment that seals a city's fate, because cities depend on density, on maintenance, on participation. When enough people leave, services collapse, roads decay, water systems fail, markets shrink. Each departure makes the next one easier. The city enters a feedback loop of abandonment. Archaeologists often find something haunting in the last layers of occupation: carelessness. Pottery becomes cruder, repairs are temporary, trash accumulates, not because people stopped caring, but because they stopped believing the place was permanent. Why invest in perfection when you suspect this is not where your story ends? This shift from permanence to impermanence is the psychological tipping point of collapse. Once it happens, no decree can reverse it. You cannot order belief, you cannot command hope. Cities live and die in the human mind long before stones fall. Another illusion we carry is that collapse must be dramatic to be real. We expect flames, screams, final battles, but the truth is quieter. A market day that no longer happens, a canal left uncleared, a ceremony skipped for the first time in memory. These are the real endings. The silent cities also teach us something uncomfortable about intelligence. These societies were not unaware of danger. They were often deeply aware. Records speak of droughts, floods, famine, unrest. Leaders debated solutions. Engineers proposed fixes. Priests adjusted rituals. The problem was not ignorance. The problem was constraint. Every solution existed within political, cultural, and economic limits. Some changes were unthinkable, some threatened power structures, some challenged belief itself. And so, societies often chose manageable decline over disruptive transformation, until decline became unmanageable. Consider how often solutions addressed symptoms, not causes. When crops failed, rituals intensified. When unrest grew, authority tightened. When resources dwindled, expansion was attempted. These responses made sense within existing frameworks, but frameworks can trap thought. A civilization cannot imagine solutions that undermine the logic of its own existence. And when the environment demands those very solutions, paralysis follows. There is another silence hidden within abandoned cities, the silence of records. Writing stops, dates vanish, names disappear. This absence is telling. Writing requires institutions, scribes, materials, stability. When writing ends, it signals not ignorance, but loss of surplus. There is no time to record history when survival dominates every decision. The city forgets itself before the world forgets the city. One of the cruelest aspects of collapse is that it punishes cooperation. Early on, cooperation keeps societies alive. People share resources, pool labor, trust leadership. But as scarcity deepens, cooperation becomes risky. If you share, you may starve. If you trust, you may be exploited. If you obey, you may be sacrificed. Self-preservation replaces collective identity. This shift is invisible in ruins, but devastating in life. Civilization is not stone, it is trust. And trust is fragile. The silent cities also reveal how deeply humans shape and are shaped by their environments. Forests cleared to build temples, rivers redirected to feed fields, hills terraced for crops. These acts created abundance but also dependency. When environments changed, societies could not simply return to older ways. Too much had been altered, too many options removed. Success narrowed future choices. Time and again, archaeology reveals that collapses coincide with climate variability, not just change, but unpredictability. Civilizations thrive on patterns, planting seasons, flood cycles, trade routes. When patterns break, planning fails, and planning is the foundation of urban life. Nomadic societies adapt quickly. Cities cannot. The very thing that makes cities powerful, their fixed nature, makes them vulnerable. There is a moment in every decline when leaders face an impossible choice. Reduce population or risk famine, abandon ideology or lose legitimacy, share power or lose control. These choices define whether a civilization transforms or fractures. Too often, elites choose delay. Delay feels safe. It preserves authority today even if it erodes tomorrow, but delay compounds problems. By the time action becomes unavoidable, options have vanished. It is tempting to judge these decisions harshly. But we must remember, leaders operate within the same psychological limits as everyone else. They fear instability. They fear rebellion. They fear being remembered as the ones who broke tradition. Ironically, this fear ensures they are remembered as the ones who presided over collapse. One of the most profound lessons of silent cities is that decline is not evenly distributed. Some neighborhoods thrive while others decay. Some regions adapt while others fail. This unevenness masks the problem. As long as the elite core survives, collapse seems distant. By the time it reaches the center, it is too late. What remains after cities fall is not emptiness, but transformation. Trade routes shift, languages evolve, beliefs merge. New societies rise on the periphery. History is not a straight line, it is a river that changes course. The ruins we see are not endings, they are bends, yet we remain haunted by the silence because it reminds us that complexity has a cost. That coordination requires constant renewal, that no system, no matter how brilliant, escapes entropy. Perhaps the most unsettling realization is this: every silent city once believed it was different, more advanced, more favored, more permanent. They studied the ruins of earlier societies and believed they had learned the lesson. They were wrong not because they ignored history, but because they underestimated how subtly decline operates. Collapse does not arrive as a stranger. It arrives disguised as continuity. The same rituals, the same titles, the same monuments, just thinner, weaker, hollower, until one day someone decides not to rebuild. When we stand among ruins today, we are not witnessing failure. We are witnessing a completed experiment, an answer to a question humanity keeps asking: how complex can we become before flexibility gives way to fragility? The silent cities answer softly: more complex than we think, less resilient than we hope. And so, as we leave these abandoned streets behind, one truth follows us. Civilizations do not vanish because people forget how to live. They vanish because the ways they chose to live no longer fit the world they created. Silence is not the enemy, inflexibility is. Silence does something else when it lingers long enough. It turns places into myths. Long after a city empties, long after the last footstep fades, stories begin to grow. Travelers speculate. Later civilizations imagine. Outsiders invent explanations that say more about themselves than about the people who left. The ruins become warnings or fantasies or moral lessons. Rarely are they understood on their own terms. When later societies encountered abandoned cities, they almost never assumed choice or adaptation. They assumed catastrophe, a curse, a punishment, a sudden destruction. This tells us something important about the human mind. We struggle to accept gradual endings. We prefer drama. We prefer villains. We prefer final moments we can point to and say, that was it. But collapse resists storytelling. It stretches across generations. It hides inside routines. It leaves no single culprit, and so silence confuses us. In many cases, later civilizations built directly on top of fallen ones. They reused stones, repurposed roads, occupied temples without knowing who first consecrated them. To them, the ruins were resources, not mysteries. This layering hides collapse even further. What looks like continuity is often reinvention. Sometimes the silence itself becomes sacred. Abandoned cities are treated as forbidden zones, haunted spaces, places of power. This reverence preserves ruins but distorts memory. The real story of decline becomes buried beneath legend. Archaeology cuts through myth not by drama but by patience. Layer by layer, grain by grain, bone by bone. What it reveals is not sudden annihilation, but negotiation. Negotiation with environment. Negotiation with scarcity. Negotiation with social limits. Collapse is not a scream. It is a conversation that fails. One of the most revealing signs of this failure is migration. Migration is often portrayed as chaos, but in reality it is strategy. People move toward opportunity, toward water, toward safety. The abandoned city is not where people died. It is where they decided not to stay. Migration leaves subtle traces, changes in pottery styles, new architectural forms elsewhere. Languages carrying borrowed words, civilizations do not disappear, they disperse. The silence at the center is echoed by growth at the edges. This challenges another comforting illusion that collapse cleans the slate. It does not. Problems migrate with people. Knowledge migrates too. The future is built from the fragments of the past. Why then do silent cities feel like failures? Because cities represent concentration, power, wealth, identity, control. When they empty, it feels like loss, even if people survive. We equate cities with civilization itself, but civilization is more than stone and streets. It is adaptation, and adaptation often means letting go. Letting go is the hardest act for any complex system. Institutions resist it, traditions resist it, egos resist it. Cities are monuments to refusal. They say we will stay. Silence says otherwise. There is a dangerous comfort in believing collapse only happens to others. To ancient people, to isolated societies, to those who mismanaged resources, but the ruins tell a different story. They show competence, planning, intelligence. They show people doing their best within constraints they did not choose. Collapse is not a moral failure, it is a systemic one. Systems fail not because individuals are bad, but because incentives misalign with reality. When success is measured by growth, growth continues past sustainability. When power depends on expansion, limits become threats. When stability is rewarded over adaptation, warning signs are ignored. These dynamics are ancient. They are also familiar. One of the most haunting aspects of silent cities is how much effort went into denying decline. Late-stage monuments often appear during times of stress. Bigger temples, more elaborate rituals, stricter laws. This is not arrogance, it is fear. Fear that if the appearance of order is maintained, the reality will follow. Sometimes it works, sometimes it does not. Civilizations are remarkably good at surviving stress. They endure droughts, wars, plagues. What they struggle with is sustained pressure without relief. Stress becomes baseline, emergency becomes normal. Eventually, resilience becomes exhaustion. There is a concept archaeologists rarely speak aloud but understand deeply: collapse fatigue. When adaptation has been demanded too often, people disengage. They stop believing effort will change outcomes. They comply outwardly but withdraw inwardly. This quiet withdrawal is lethal to complex systems. Look again at abandoned streets. Notice how few signs of panic exist. No barricades, no mass destruction, no evidence of final battles. These were not places overwhelmed. They were places slowly emptied. People packed what they could. They took children, tools, seeds. They left behind what was too heavy: stone, memory, identity. Silence followed them. The tragedy of silent cities is not that they fell. It is that they could not imagine becoming something else. Their structures were too rigid, their symbols too fixed, their success too specific. They solved yesterday's problems perfectly. Tomorrow required different answers. Every civilization defines itself by what it values: order, growth, power, faith, continuity. These values guide decisions long after circumstances change. Collapse occurs when values outlive usefulness. The silent cities also reveal the limits of prediction. Even societies with advanced astronomy and mathematics failed to foresee their own decline. Why? Because collapse is not linear. Small changes accumulate invisibly. By the time patterns emerge, feedback loops are already in motion. The future arrives faster than expectation. One of the most sobering lessons is this: civilizations do not collapse because they lack knowledge. They collapse because knowledge is filtered through belief. Evidence competes with identity. When evidence threatens identity, identity usually wins, until it cannot. Standing in ruins, we often ask what went wrong, but a better question might be, what went right for so long? How did these societies sustain millions of lives for centuries? How did they build systems that endured despite immense challenges? Collapse does not erase achievement, it contextualizes it. The silence that follows a city's abandonment is not empty. It is full of paths not taken, alternate futures. Different choices, moments where adaptation might have changed outcomes, but history does not preserve hypotheticals, only results, and the result is this: stone remains, people move on, memory fades, silence endures. Yet silence is not the end of the story, because new civilizations rise. They study the ruins, they reuse the land, they repeat patterns, sometimes knowingly, often not. The cycle continues, not because humans are foolish, but because complexity invites repetition. Each generation believes it has solved the problem of permanence. Each generation is partially right and partially wrong. The silent cities do not judge us, they do not warn with words, they simply exist. They ask us to notice patterns, not to fear collapse, but to understand transformation. They remind us that endurance requires flexibility, humility, and willingness to abandon what no longer serves. As the sun sets over abandoned streets, shadows stretch across stone that once echoed with life. The silence feels heavy, but it is not hostile, it is reflective. It waits for us to decide what we will learn, because the story of vanished civilizations is not finished, it is ongoing, and the next chapter has not yet been written. There is a moment after the people have gone when a city stops being a place and becomes a question. Walls still stand, roads still lead somewhere. Doorways still frame empty space. But the logic that once animated them is gone. The city no longer explains itself. This is when silence becomes permanent, not because no one speaks, but because no one remembers why this place mattered. Time behaves differently in abandoned cities. Without maintenance, years compress. A century of decay can happen faster than a decade of growth. Roofs collapse, wood rots, metal disappears, stone endures, but even stone softens. Nature is not violent here. It is methodical. Roots pry apart foundations, moss erases carvings, wind polishes edges smooth. The city is not destroyed, it is unmade. What once took generations to build dissolves into landscape, and yet even in this unmaking traces persist. A footprint hardened in clay, a child's toy dropped near a doorway, ash from a final cooking fire. These fragments tell us something profound. The end of a city is made of ordinary days, no final speech, no last ceremony. Just routines that slowly stop repeating. When historians look back, they mark endings with dates, but the people who lived there did not experience an ending. They experienced uncertainty. Should we stay another season? Should we send scouts elsewhere? Should we trust the leaders one more time? These questions lingered for years, sometimes generations. The silence we hear now is the echo of indecision. As cities fade, something else happens quietly. Authority dissolves. Titles lose meaning. Borders blur. Laws become suggestions. Power no longer flows from institutions. It flows from proximity, kinship, adaptability. This decentralization is not chaos, it is reorganization. Civilization does not disappear, it changes scale. One of the most enduring myths about collapse is that it represents failure of morality, that people grew greedy or lazy or corrupt, but archaeology tells a different story. People worked harder near the end, not less. They innovated more, not less. They endured suffering with remarkable resilience. What failed was not character. What failed was alignment between systems and reality. There is a quiet cruelty in this. Individuals bear the cost of decisions made long before they were born. They inherit infrastructure that cannot adapt, beliefs that cannot bend, expectations that cannot be met. Collapse is intergenerational. No single group causes it. No single group escapes it. This raises an uncomfortable truth. No civilization collapses in isolation. The choices of the past constrain the options of the present. We do not start from zero, we start from inheritance. Many silent cities were victims of their own legacy. Their success locked them into patterns that could not change fast enough. The canals that once ensured abundance required constant upkeep. The roads that enabled trade demanded protection. The hierarchies that ensured order resisted reform. Success became obligation, and obligation became burden. When pressure becomes constant, people adapt psychologically. They normalize scarcity, they lower expectations, they redefine success. This is not denial, it is survival. But normalization hides danger. When crisis feels ordinary, urgency disappears, and without urgency, systems drift. Another pattern emerges across vanished civilizations, the erosion of shared purpose. Early on, cities are bound by common goals: survival, growth, defense. Later, these goals fragment. Elites pursue stability. Merchants pursue profit. Farmers pursue survival. When goals diverge, cooperation weakens. Civilization becomes a collection of parallel interests rather than a shared project. Silence grows in the gaps. Rituals often persist longest. Ceremonies continue even as cities shrink. Why? Because rituals provide meaning when material conditions deteriorate. They reassure. They connect people to history, but rituals cannot feed populations. When symbolic continuity replaces practical adaptation, collapse accelerates. Meaning without material support becomes hollow. In the final stages, cities become performative. Authority is displayed, not exercised. Stability is declared, not experienced. Hope is promised, not planned. From the outside, everything appears intact. From the inside, everyone knows something is wrong. This dissonance is exhausting. And exhaustion breeds departure. Leaving is rarely dramatic. Families slip away quietly. Neighborhoods thin out. Services become unreliable. At first, absence is invisible. Then it becomes noticeable. Then it becomes normal. Finally, it becomes defining. One day, a city crosses an invisible threshold. Below this threshold, it can recover. Above it, decline accelerates. This is not a moral boundary. It is a logistical one. Too few people to maintain infrastructure. Too little trade to support specialization. Too much decay to reverse. Recovery would require more energy than remains. At that point, abandonment is not failure, it is efficiency. From a distance, abandonment looks tragic. From within, it can feel like relief. Relief from taxes that no longer protect. Relief from rituals that no longer answer. Relief from promises that no longer convince. Leaving allows people to reclaim agency. The city becomes a memory. Memory, however, is fragile. Generations pass, stories change, children grow up elsewhere, landscapes shift, languages evolve. The city fades from lived experience into legend. This is when silence becomes complete. Centuries later, outsiders arrive. They marvel at the ruins. They speculate wildly. They project their fears and values onto stone. The people who left are voiceless now. The city speaks only through interpretation. This is why silent cities are so powerful. They cannot correct us. They cannot explain nuance. They force us to confront uncertainty. And humans dislike uncertainty. So we simplify, we call it collapse, we call it failure, we call it warning, but the truth is more complicated. Silent cities are not tombstones, they are transition points, markers where one form of organization ended and another began. History did not stop, it rerouted. There is a humility required to truly learn from vanished civilizations. We must resist the urge to feel superior. We must accept that intelligence, technology, and ambition do not guarantee longevity. We must recognize that we are subject to the same dynamics, not because history repeats, but because systems behave consistently under pressure. Every civilization faces limits, ecological limits, social limits, cognitive limits. The question is not whether limits exist. The question is how societies respond when they are reached. Some respond with flexibility. They decentralize. They diversify. They simplify. Others respond with rigidity. They centralize. They intensify. They double down. The silent cities overwhelmingly belong to the second group. It is tempting to imagine that we would choose differently, that we would recognize the signs, that we would act in time. But every vanished civilization believed the same. They had experts, they had planners, they had warnings, they also had constraints. Understanding silent cities requires empathy, not judgment. These were not foolish people. They were people navigating uncertainty with incomplete information, competing priorities, and inherited systems, just like us. As we move further away from these vanished places in time, the silence grows louder, not because there is more to hear, but because we are finally quiet enough to listen. The ruins do not shout, they wait. They wait for us to realize that permanence is not built, it is maintained, and maintenance requires constant adjustment. The final lesson of silent cities is not pessimism, it is responsibility. Responsibility to design systems that can shrink as well as grow. Responsibility to value adaptability over scale. Responsibility to accept change before it is forced, because the silence does not arrive suddenly, it arrives politely, it knocks, it waits, and if unanswered long enough, it stays. There comes a point, long after a city has fallen silent, when even silence begins to change. At first, silence is absence. Later, it becomes atmosphere. Eventually, it becomes inheritance. The wind learns the streets, rain learns the rooftops, animals learn the paths humans once walked daily. The city does not disappear, it is absorbed, and in that absorption lies a truth we often resist. Civilization is not separate from nature, it is a phase within it. For those who left the silent cities, the story did not end at the city gates. They carried knowledge with them. Seeds adapted to different soils, stories reshaped for new landscapes, skills refined under pressure. In many cases, collapse produced resilience elsewhere. What failed in one place succeeded in another. History rarely rewards loyalty to place, it rewards loyalty to survival. This dispersal of people and knowledge is why humanity persists despite repeated systemic failure. Civilizations are fragile, humanity is not. The silence of cities is balanced by the continuity of people. Yet even as people endure, something irreplaceable is lost. Cities are memory machines. They store shared identity in architecture, layout, ritual space. They anchor history in physical form. When cities empty, memory scatters. Without walls, stories change faster. Without monuments, time flattens. Without records, the past becomes flexible. This is both loss and liberation. The loss is obvious. We mourn what cannot be rebuilt. We study ruins to reconstruct meaning. We feel all mixed with regret, but liberation is quieter. Without rigid structures, cultures can adapt. Without fixed hierarchies, power redistributes. Without inherited obligations, new identities form. Silence clears space. One reason silent cities disturb us is because they challenge our faith in progress. We are taught that history moves forward, that knowledge accumulates, that mistakes are not repeated. The ruins disagree. They show that progress is conditional, that advancement can reverse. That knowledge can be lost, that repetition is human. This is not cynicism. It is realism. Civilizations are experiments. Some last centuries, some millennia, none last forever. Each tests a different arrangement of power, resources, belief, and environment. Silent cities are the results, data points written in stone, yet we rarely read them that way. We search for morality tales. We seek blame. We want reassurance that collapse happens only when people deserve it. But collapse is indifferent to deserving. It follows structure. Structure determines resilience. How centralized is power? How flexible is belief? How diverse are resources? How quickly can systems change? These questions matter more than virtue. Another uncomfortable realization emerges from studying silent cities. The greatest threat to long-term survival is short-term success. Success reduces urgency. Success reinforces existing systems. Success silences critics. When everything works, warnings sound unnecessary. By the time cracks appear, defenders of the status quo are entrenched. Many silent cities reached their peak shortly before decline. Population highs, monumental construction, territorial expansion. From the outside, they looked invincible. From the inside, they were overstretched. This is why collapse so often surprises. Indicators lag behind reality. We imagine that collapse should be obvious, but from within it looks like prosperity with problems. And every prosperous society has problems. The challenge is knowing which problems are symptoms and which are signals. One of the most subtle signals is maintenance failure, when roads are repaired less frequently, when water systems clog, when public spaces decay. Maintenance is invisible when it works. When it fails, it reveals strain. Civilizations that glorify creation over upkeep accelerate decline. Another signal is narrative rigidity. When leaders repeat the same explanations despite changing evidence, when dissent is framed as betrayal, when solutions are constrained by ideology, narratives that cannot evolve trap societies in outdated responses. There is also a cultural signal, nostalgia. When societies obsess over a perceived golden age, they stop imagining alternative futures. Restoration replaces innovation. Memory replaces planning. The past becomes a refuge from uncertainty. This is dangerous. As decline progresses, people adapt individually faster than institutions. Families diversify livelihoods, communities relocate seasonally, networks replace centralized authority, institutions lag, they enforce rules designed for a world that no longer exists. This mismatch accelerates abandonment. Eventually, institutions collapse under their own weight, not with drama but with irrelevance. People stop showing up, stop complying, stop caring. Authority evaporates. What remains after institutional collapse is culture. Songs, stories, skills, these are lighter than stone. They travel, they survive. This is why silent cities do not represent total loss. They represent shedding. Human societies shed forms that no longer function, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes too late, but shedding is survival. The ruins we see today are not warnings frozen in time. They are conversations still unfolding. Every excavation rewrites understanding. Every new method reveals complexity. Collapse is not a solved problem. It is an ongoing inquiry. Why does this matter now? Because the dynamics revealed by silent cities are not ancient, they are structural. They apply wherever complexity meets limits. They apply wherever growth outpaces adaptation. They apply wherever belief outruns evidence. The silent cities show us that resilience is not strength, it is responsiveness, the ability to change form without losing function. They also show us that humility matters. Civilizations that believed themselves exceptional ignored patterns. Those that recognized limits survived longer, not forever, but longer. Another lesson hides in scale. Large systems fail differently than small ones. The bigger the system, the harder it is to pivot. The more stakeholders, the more resistance. The more infrastructure, the more inertia. Cities magnify both success and failure. This is why some collapses appear sudden. The system resists change until it cannot, then breaks rapidly. From stability to silence in a single generation, the speed is shocking only because the pressure was invisible. One of the final acts before silence is often denial, not ignorance but active dismissal. Warnings are reframed as exaggeration, evidence is politicized, experts are sidelined. This is not unique to the past, it is human. Denial is comforting, it preserves identity, it postpones fear, it maintains normalcy. But it does not change reality, it only delays response. In silent cities, we see denial etched into stone, last monuments built as resources vanish, final inscriptions praising stability amid decline, ceremonies intensifying as systems fail. The louder the reassurance, the closer the silence. Yet even in denial there is hope, because denial indicates awareness. People deny what they sense but cannot face. This means collapse is not blind, it is resisted. Resistance matters. It slows decline, it buys time, it creates space for alternatives. Sometimes that time is enough, sometimes it is not. The silence we inherit today is selective. We see ruins, not the societies that successfully adapted. Survivors leave fewer monuments, they leave fewer dramatic stories, they leave continuity, which history often overlooks. This biases our understanding. We remember collapse more vividly than survival, because collapse leaves spectacle, survival leaves normalization. Silent cities dominate our imagination because they confront us with impermanence. They strip away illusions of control. They remind us that no arrangement is final, and yet there is dignity in these ruins, dignity in effort, dignity in endurance, dignity in adaptation, even when it means leaving. The people who abandoned cities were not cowards, they were pragmatists. They chose life over legacy. Perhaps that is the most radical lesson of all. That survival sometimes requires abandoning what defines you. Your city, your monuments, your identity. This is not failure, it is evolution. As we move through silent streets today, we are not walking through death. We are walking through transition. We are standing at the hinge points of history. Moments when one way of living gave way to another. The silence invites us to listen differently, not for catastrophe but for continuity, not for endings but for redirection. The cities are gone. The people remain and the patterns continue, which brings us to the present not as an accusation but as an opportunity. The silent cities do not predict our future, they illuminate our options, they show us what happens when systems outgrow flexibility. They show us the cost of waiting too long. They also show us that adaptation is always possible until it is not. Silence, then, is not a threat. It is a message, one that has been spoken many times before. One that asks us quietly when change comes, and it always does, will we cling to stone or will we move? Silence at its deepest is not emptiness, it is accumulation. It is every choice deferred, every repair postponed, every warning softened by hope. It is the weight of decisions stacked gently over time until the structure beneath them gives way. When we imagine collapse, we imagine failure. When collapse actually happens, it feels like fatigue, a long tiredness. A sense that effort no longer changes outcomes, a quiet understanding that the future will not look like the past. This is the moment civilizations rarely record because it does not feel historic, it feels personal. For the people living through it, decline is experienced not as theory but as daily compromise, a shorter meal, a longer walk for water, a tool repaired one more time instead of replaced. Each compromise is reasonable, each one survivable. Together they redraw the boundaries of what is acceptable. This is how limits become normalized. There is a psychological threshold every society crosses without noticing. At first, hardship is framed as temporary, then as cyclical, eventually as permanent. Once hardship is accepted as permanent, ambition shrinks. People stop asking how to restore abundance and begin asking how to endure scarcity. This shift is subtle but irreversible. Civilizations do not collapse when they suffer. They collapse when suffering becomes the baseline. In silent cities, this shift is etched into infrastructure. Storage spaces grow larger, defensive structures multiply, public spaces shrink, architecture becomes cautious. Where once cities expanded outward with confidence, they now contract inward with concern. This is not paranoia. It is adaptation under stress, but adaptation has trade-offs. Resources diverted to defense are not used for innovation. Labor spent maintaining failing systems is not spent building new ones. The future is consumed by the present. This is how civilizations become trapped in maintenance loops, keeping complex systems alive just long enough to prevent reinvention. Another illusion shatters here. That collapse is always unwanted. Sometimes people welcome it, not the suffering but the release. Release from obligations they did not choose. Release from authorities that no longer protect. Release from cities that demand more than they give. Leaving becomes liberation. We tend to romanticize cities as engines of culture and progress. And they are, but they are also engines of extraction. They concentrate labor. They demand surplus. They reward conformity. When conditions are favorable, this exchange feels fair. When conditions change, it feels oppressive. The city becomes a burden. This is why some of the most advanced civilizations in history were abandoned not in chaos, but in waves. People left deliberately. They dismantled roofs to reuse beams. They packed tools and seeds. They carried stories forward. This was not collapse as catastrophe. It was collapse as migration. Migration, however, disrupts identity. Who are you without your city, without its rituals, without its landmarks? This loss of shared reference is destabilizing. New communities must renegotiate meaning from scratch. This is why post-collapse societies often appear simpler, not because people forgot complexity, but because complexity requires trust built over time. Trust is expensive. It requires predictability. It requires fairness. It requires belief in continuity. When continuity fails, trust fragments. People turn inward. Families replace institutions. Local networks replace centralized authority. This decentralization is adaptive but limits scale. Cities require trust among strangers. Without it, urban life dissolves. Silent cities remind us that trust is infrastructure, as real as roads, as necessary as water, and far more fragile. Another deeply human factor emerges repeatedly in collapse: fear of loss, not fear of death, but fear of losing status, meaning, identity. Elites fear losing power, priests fear losing belief, craftspeople fear losing relevance. These fears shape decisions more than abstract survival. Systems defend themselves even when defense accelerates failure. This creates tragic feedback loops. To preserve authority, leaders tighten control. Control breeds resentment. Resentment undermines cooperation. Without cooperation, systems fail faster. The attempt to prevent collapse becomes its engine. It is important to say this clearly. Collapse is rarely caused by one mistake. It is caused by the accumulation of rational decisions made under pressure. Each decision solves a short-term problem. Each one narrows future options. This is not stupidity. It is path dependence. Path dependence explains why civilizations often continue strategies long after their effectiveness fades. Changing course is costly. Admitting error threatens legitimacy. And so societies commit harder to plans designed for a world that no longer exists. In the ruins, we see evidence of this commitment everywhere. Canals extended beyond necessity. Terraces built higher despite erosion. Monuments erected amid scarcity. These are not signs of arrogance. They are signs of belief. Belief that effort can overcome limits. Sometimes it can, sometimes it cannot. The silent cities teach us something else we rarely acknowledge. Nature does not need to be hostile to be decisive. A small reduction in rainfall, a slight increase in temperature variability, a modest shift in river patterns, these are enough. Complex systems amplify small changes. What begins as inconvenience becomes instability. Instability becomes crisis. From the outside, it appears sudden. From the inside, it feels endless. This difference in perspective is why collapse is so often misunderstood. Another haunting aspect of silent cities is how quickly memory fades. Within a few generations, the reasons for abandonment blur. Children grow up hearing fragments. Grandparents remember details but not causes. Legends replace analysis. This forgetting protects survivors psychologically. To dwell on loss is dangerous, better to focus forward, but forgetting also invites repetition. Without understanding why a city failed, future societies rebuild similar systems, often in the same places. The land remembers even if people do not. Floodplains flood again. Drought-prone regions dry again. Earthquakes return. Ruins are warnings written in geography. And yet, humans return, because opportunity often outweighs memory. Fertile soil remains fertile until it does not. Trade routes remain valuable until they shift. Hope overrides caution. This is not foolishness. It is how progress happens at all. Every civilization balances risk and reward. Silent cities mark points where that balance tipped too far, but they also show us that risk-taking built greatness in the first place. There is no civilization without risk. The danger lies not in risk, but in refusing to reassess it. One of the hardest truths revealed by silent cities is that collapse is not evenly harmful. Some benefit. As central power weakens, peripheral groups gain autonomy. As monopolies break, local exchange flourishes. As rigid hierarchies fall, new voices emerge. Collapse redistributes power even as it destroys structure. This redistribution is messy. It creates winners and losers. History often remembers only the losses because they leave ruins. The gains leave fewer monuments. As scholars reconstruct these stories, they must resist nostalgia. Not all silent cities deserve mourning. Some were oppressive, some were exploitative, some thrived on inequality. Their fall may have improved life for many. Silence is not always tragic. Sometimes it is justice delayed. This complicates our emotional response. We want to grieve what was lost, but we must also ask, lost for whom? Who benefited from the city's power? Who bore its costs? Collapse rebalances these equations. Another pattern emerges when examining long-term outcomes. Civilizations that collapse dramatically often leave deep scars. Civilizations that dissolve gradually leave continuity. The quieter the ending, the smoother the transition. Silent cities, paradoxically, often indicate resilience. People had time to adapt. They were not wiped out. They moved. This reframes silence as something other than defeat. Silence can be mercy. Yet even gradual collapse leaves trauma. Displacement is painful. Loss of identity wounds deeply. Rebuilding takes generations. Survival is not painless, but it is possible. The ruins stand as reminders not of what humanity lost, but of what it outgrew. We tend to think of progress as addition. In reality, it often involves subtraction, letting go of systems that no longer serve, abandoning places that no longer sustain, releasing identities that constrain adaptation. The silent cities whisper this lesson persistently. Growth is optional. Adaptation is not. As we study them, we are tempted to ask the wrong question. Not why did they collapse, but why didn't they adapt sooner? The answer is rarely ignorance. It is fear. Fear of losing what works, fear of change, fear of uncertainty, and fear is ancient. Fear drives societies to cling to stone, ritual, hierarchy, and certainty, but the world is not obligated to remain stable. When it changes, fear becomes liability. Perhaps the most profound realization is this: collapse is not the opposite of success. It is the consequence of success pursued without restraint. The silent cities are not mistakes to avoid. They are experiences to learn from. They tell us that civilization is not a destination. It is a practice, one that requires constant recalibration. And so the silence continues, not as a warning shouted from the past, but as a quiet presence beside us, waiting to see whether we will listen. Silence, when examined closely, is not the absence of sound. It is the absence of urgency. In silent cities, nothing is demanding attention anymore. No bells call workers, no markets announce the day. No rulers proclaim decrees. Time loses its structure, and when time loses structure, meaning begins to drift. For those who remained longest in these cities, the final years were not dramatic, they were suspended. Life continued in fragments. A family living in one wing of a palace now too large to heat. A handful of merchants trading in a market built for thousands. A temple still tended, but by habit rather than belief. These were not ruins, yet they were shells. Shells are dangerous because they preserve appearance without function. From afar, the city still looks alive. From within, it feels hollow. This hollowing is the true end of urban life. Cities are coordination machines. They synchronize labor, belief, and exchange at scale. When coordination fails, cities lose purpose. People can survive without cities. Cities cannot survive without people acting together. One of the least visible aspects of collapse is boredom. Not the boredom of leisure, but the boredom of stagnation, when innovation stops, when opportunities shrink, when the future feels repetitive. This emotional fatigue pushes people away as surely as famine. Hope is a resource. When it depletes, migration accelerates. Silent cities reveal that human motivation is as critical as material supply. You can feed people and still lose them, because people do not stay only for survival, they stay for possibility. When possibility disappears, stone means nothing. Another hidden force in collapse is generational fracture. Older generations cling to tradition. Younger generations see no future within it. This tension erodes continuity. Young people leave first. They are more mobile, less invested in legacy. More willing to gamble, their departure accelerates decline. Cities age rapidly once youth disappears. Archaeological evidence supports this. Late-stage settlements often show fewer signs of child activity. Fewer toys, fewer small dwellings. A city without children is already gone. The silence of cities is therefore not just physical, it is demographic. We often imagine that people abandoned cities reluctantly, but many departures were intentional, even hopeful. New lands promised autonomy. Smaller communities promised fairness. Mobility promised control over one's fate. Cities offered stability, but stability had become illusion. This tension between stability and autonomy defines the final phase of many civilizations. Stability requires structure. Autonomy requires flexibility. When structures become constraints, autonomy wins. People choose uncertainty over stagnation. This choice is deeply human. Throughout history, movement has been a strategy. Sedentary life is an experiment, not the default. Cities represent one extreme of that experiment. Silent cities mark its limits. Another pattern repeats across vanished civilizations. Specialization collapse. Cities depend on specialists. Bakers, smiths, scribes, engineers. When population declines, specialization fails. A city cannot function if too many specialists disappear. Generalists replace them, but cities are not built for generalists. Rural life adapts. Urban life dissolves. This is why many abandoned cities were never fully reoccupied. Once specialization collapses, rebuilding urban systems requires external input. Without it, ruins remain ruins. Silence also changes how power is remembered. Victors write history, but collapse erases victors. What remains is ambiguity. Who ruled, who decided, who failed? Without records, power loses its narrative. Silence levels hierarchy. Kings and commoners vanish into the same soil. This leveling is unsettling. It challenges the belief that power endures. The silent cities prove it does not. In this sense, ruins are deeply democratic. They remind us that status is temporary. Stone outlasts titles, yet even stone does not last forever. Erosion is patient. Everything built is borrowed time. This realization lies at the heart of why silent cities feel philosophical. they confront us with impermanence made visible. Modern observers often ask, could these collapses have been prevented? Sometimes, but prevention requires foresight, cooperation, and sacrifice. It requires acting before pain is undeniable. Humans rarely do this, not because we are incapable, but because incentives discourage it. Sacrifice now for benefit later is politically dangerous. Leaders who propose it risk removal. Those who promise continuity are rewarded until continuity fails. This dynamic is ancient. It did not begin with modernity. Silent cities reveal the cost of delayed action, not immediate annihilation, but gradual erosion of options. By the time crisis is universally acknowledged, choice has narrowed. The path forward is constrained. Another lesson emerges here: resilience is not efficiency. Highly efficient systems minimize redundancy. They waste nothing, but redundancy is insurance. When conditions change, efficiency becomes fragility. Silent cities often represent systems optimized too tightly. When a component failed, nothing replaced it. This applies to water systems, food production, trade networks, governance. Efficiency felt like progress. It became vulnerability. The silence left behind is therefore not accidental. It is structural. It reflects how systems were designed. This raises an uncomfortable question. Are we building for stability or resilience? Stability assumes the future resembles the past. Resilience assumes it will not. Silent cities assumed stability. As silence spreads, nature does not mourn, it adapts instantly. Animals move in, plants reclaim space, ecosystems rebalance. What humans see as loss, nature sees as opportunity. Cities were interruptions, silence is restoration. This perspective reframes collapse entirely. From nature's view, silent cities are not failures, they are corrections. This does not mean human suffering is insignificant. But it does mean that human systems are not central, they are participants. The ruins remind us of this humility. They place humanity back into ecological time. A brief chapter, a powerful one, but not permanent. For many people, this realization is unsettling. We want permanence. We want our efforts to matter forever. Silent cities say otherwise. They say, matter is temporary, meaning is local, continuity is earned. Yet paradoxically, the very act of studying ruins gives them new life. We assign meaning, we reconstruct stories, we remember. In this way, silence is never complete, but memory alone cannot revive a city. It can only inform future choices. The question silent cities ultimately pose is not, will civilization collapse? Because collapse is inevitable in some form. The real question is, how will it change? Will transformation be violent or gradual? Will it be forced or chosen? Will it preserve dignity or erase it? Silent cities suggest that gradual change, though painful, preserves humanity. Abrupt collapse destroys continuity. Silence, when slow, allows survival. This reframes our fear. The enemy is not change, the enemy is denial. As we move deeper into understanding these vanished places, one truth becomes unavoidable. Civilization is not something we build once. It is something we renegotiate constantly, with nature, with each other, with the future. The silent cities stopped renegotiating. They assumed agreements would hold. They did not, and yet they were not foolish. They were human. They hoped. They trusted. They worked. They endured until endurance was no longer enough. Their silence is not condemnation. It is inheritance. We inherit their knowledge, their mistakes, their warnings, their resilience. We inherit the responsibility to listen. Silence, then, is not the end of the story. It is the pause between chapters. A space where reflection becomes possible, a moment before the next experiment begins. The ruins stand not as graves, but as thresholds. Behind them lies what was, ahead lies what could be. And the silence asks us patiently, what will we build that can change? What will we let go when it must? What will we cling to long after it stops serving? These questions echo through empty streets. They do not demand answers, but they will not disappear because silence is never empty. It is full of consequences, and we are still writing them. Silence, when it stretches across centuries, becomes a mirror. It reflects not only what vanished, but what endures. It forces us to confront a truth that civilizations rarely acknowledge while alive. That permanence is a story we tell ourselves to make uncertainty bearable. The silent cities tell a different story. They tell us that nothing built by humans is immune to time, pressure, or change. And yet nothing human is ever entirely erased. What remains after collapse is not chaos. It is continuity in disguise. When cities empty, people do not vanish into nothingness. They reorganize, they simplify, they adapt. They reassemble society in forms that fit new realities. The disappearance of cities is often the birth of something else. History just rarely pauses long enough to notice. The absence of cities alters how people relate to one another. Without towering centers of authority, relationships become more personal. Reputation matters more than law. Trust is earned face to face. Leadership becomes situational, not institutional. This is not regression, it is recalibration. Complex systems simplify under stress, returning to forms that require less energy to sustain. Energy is the invisible currency of civilization. Cities demand enormous flows of it: food, water, labor, attention. When energy becomes scarce or unpredictable, cities are the first structures to fail. They are not weak, they are hungry. Silent cities show us that collapse is not a moral judgment rendered by history. It is an accounting problem. When inputs fall below requirements for too long, systems downsize. That is all. This understanding strips collapse of drama and replaces it with responsibility. If collapse is structural, then prevention is structural too. Not heroic, not dramatic. Structural, yet prevention is rarely pursued seriously because it requires confronting limits, and limits threaten identity. Civilizations define themselves by what they overcome. Limits suggest something cannot be overcome. This is deeply uncomfortable. Silent cities reveal what happens when discomfort is deferred too long. Limits do not disappear, they accumulate, they wait. One of the great tragedies hidden in ruins is that adaptation often came too late. Not because solutions were unknown, but because they were unacceptable: reducing population, relinquishing territory, redistributing power, abandoning sacred traditions. These options existed. They were simply unthinkable. Every civilization has taboos, lines it cannot cross without losing itself. Collapse often occurs when survival demands crossing those lines. At that point, the choice is no longer between prosperity and sacrifice. It is between identity and life. Some choose identity. Some choose life. The silent cities are where identity won briefly. And yet, identity never fully dies, it transforms. People carry fragments forward, beliefs evolve, languages shift, symbols reappear in altered forms. The city may vanish, but its cultural DNA persists. This is why collapse is not annihilation, it is mutation. Modern observers often ask what lessons silent cities offer. But lessons are dangerous things, they imply certainty. What ruins offer is not instruction, but perspective. They show patterns, they show consequences, they show possibilities. The most consistent pattern is this: civilizations that survive longest are those that accept impermanence. They plan for contraction as well as expansion. They value redundancy over efficiency. They tolerate dissent. They revise belief when evidence demands it. They decentralize before forced to. Silent cities, by contrast, reveal what happens when permanence is assumed. When success is mistaken for invincibility, when adaptation is postponed until it becomes impossible. Yet even here, judgment feels misplaced, because believing in permanence is not arrogance, it is hope, and hope is necessary. The problem arises when hope replaces preparation. Preparation is unglamorous. It does not build monuments, it builds buffers, redundancy, flexibility, diversity. These do not impress, they endure. As we study silent cities, we must confront an unsettling idea. Some collapses were rational. Given the constraints, abandoning cities made sense. Continuing to invest would have wasted lives and resources. In these cases, collapse was not failure, it was optimization. This reframes abandonment as intelligence. Knowing when to stop is wisdom. Knowing when to leave is courage. The ruins do not tell us to fear collapse. They tell us to fear denial. They tell us to fear systems that cannot change. They tell us to fear certainty. Silence also reveals the arrogance of linear thinking. We assume that development proceeds forward or backward, but history moves sideways, it detours, it fragments, it recombines. Silent cities are not endpoints, they are intersections. From these intersections emerge new cultures, new trade routes, new technologies, new beliefs. History accelerates after collapse, not slows. This is why collapse often precedes innovation. Freed from rigid systems, people experiment. They try new forms. Some fail, some succeed spectacularly. The future is born in the wreckage of the past, yet we rarely celebrate this. We mourn the loss of what was familiar. We call collapse tragedy. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it is transformation delayed too long. Silent cities force us to reckon with attachment to place, attachment to identity, attachment to systems that once worked. These attachments are powerful, they give meaning. They also constrain choice. Civilizations that endure longest learn to loosen attachment. They preserve values but allow forms to change. They distinguish between essence and structure. This distinction is rare and difficult. One of the most profound insights offered by silent cities is that complexity has diminishing returns. Beyond a certain point, adding layers increases fragility. More rules require more enforcement. More infrastructure requires more maintenance. More specialization requires more coordination. Eventually, the cost outweighs the benefit. This threshold is invisible until crossed. Once crossed, collapse accelerates. This is why decline often feels sudden. It is not. It is delayed recognition. We often ask, could warning signs have been recognized? Yes, they usually were, but recognition alone does not produce action. Action requires alignment of incentives, and incentives rarely reward restraint. Restraint is difficult in competitive systems. If one city restrains growth, another expands, power shifts, fear drives escalation. This is how civilizations trap themselves in unsustainable races. Silent cities reveal the cost of competition without coordination. They show us what happens when no one can afford to slow down. There is also an ethical dimension hidden in ruins. Who bears the cost of collapse? Often the least powerful: farmers, laborers, peripheral communities. Those with the fewest options. Elites often leave first or insulate themselves longest. This inequality deepens trauma. Yet history shows that survivors are not always elites. Adaptability matters more than status. Those with skills, networks, and flexibility endure. Those bound tightly to institutions struggle. This is why collapse reshapes social hierarchies. Titles lose meaning. Practical knowledge rises in value. Survival reorders respect. In this reordering, something fundamental happens. Human relationships become primary again, not systems, not symbols, not monuments, people. Silent cities strip civilization to its core. They remind us that everything we build is secondary to our capacity to adapt together. As we stand in ruins, we often feel small, but perhaps that is the wrong reaction. Perhaps we should feel connected, connected to a long chain of humans who faced uncertainty and made choices with incomplete information. Connected to ancestors who did not know they were living in a pivotal moment, connected to futures that will judge us just as imperfectly. The silence does not accuse, it contextualizes. Every generation believes it stands at the center of history. Silent cities prove otherwise. They show us that many centers have existed, and all of them shifted. This realization can be frightening or freeing. If nothing is permanent, then failure is not final. If no system lasts forever, then change is not betrayal. If cities can vanish, then new forms can emerge. The question becomes not how to avoid collapse entirely, but how to shape transformation humanely, how to preserve dignity during change, how to minimize suffering, how to carry forward what matters. Silent cities show us what happens when transformation is delayed. Pressure builds, options narrow, pain increases. They also show us that when transformation is chosen early, collapse can be gentle. Cities shrink rather than vanish. Power decentralizes rather than explodes. Culture evolves rather than fractures. This is not optimism, it is pattern recognition. As the silence stretches on, it begins to speak differently, not as warning, not as lament, but as invitation. An invitation to rethink what civilization is for. An invitation to question assumptions. An invitation to design systems that expect change rather than deny it. The silent cities are not failures of imagination, they are failures of flexibility. And so, as we listen to the quiet left behind, we are not being asked to mourn endlessly. We are being asked to prepare, not for catastrophe, but for inevitability. Change will come. The only question is whether it arrives as collapse or as choice. Silence does not end the story, it hands it forward. Across the world, ruins stand where certainty once lived. Stones lie where confidence once stood upright. And in every silent city, there is an unanswered question, not about the past, but about the future. Because the true legacy of vanished civilizations is not what they lost, it is what they reveal. When we look at the remains of great cities, we often imagine ourselves as observers standing safely outside history, as if collapse belongs to another age, another people, another way of living. But history does not work that way. There is no outside, there is only continuity. Every civilization at some point believes it has escaped the cycle, that it is more advanced, more aware, more prepared, that its systems are smarter, its tools sharper, its knowledge deeper. And for a time, this belief is justified. Civilizations grow precisely because they solve problems better than those before them. But solving problems creates new ones. And the ability to solve yesterday's problems does not guarantee the ability to solve tomorrow's. The silent cities remind us of something deeply uncomfortable. Progress does not eliminate vulnerability, it redistributes it. As societies grow more complex, they reduce some risks while amplifying others. They trade scarcity for dependency, flexibility for efficiency, resilience for scale. None of this is foolish. It is the price of ambition. What ultimately determines whether a civilization transforms or collapses is not intelligence, morality, or strength. It is timing, the timing of recognition, the timing of action, the timing of letting go. Act too early and you appear weak. Act too late and you have no options left. Between those extremes lies a narrow window. History shows us how often that window is missed. The silent cities are not cautionary tales about hubris alone. They are stories about delay, delay in acknowledging limits, delay in redistributing power, delay in adapting beliefs to evidence. Delay is seductive because it feels like stability until it doesn't. There's a moment in every civilization when change becomes unavoidable. At that moment, societies choose consciously or not between transformation and breakdown. Transformation is disruptive but survivable. Breakdown is familiar but costly. Too often, familiarity wins. We like to believe collapse happens suddenly. That one event triggers everything. But collapse is rarely an explosion. It is erosion. A little trust lost here, a little flexibility lost there, a little honesty sacrificed for comfort until the structure cannot hold. The people living in silent cities did not lack courage, they lacked certainty. And certainty is the one thing history never grants. They made decisions based on what they knew, what they believed, and what they feared losing, just like us. What separates us from them is not wisdom, it is distance. Distance allows clarity, but clarity always comes late. If the silent cities teach us anything, it is this: civilization is not a thing, it is a relationship. A relationship between people and environment, between belief and evidence, between power and responsibility, between present comfort and future cost. When those relationships stay balanced, cities thrive. When they fall out of balance, cities fall silent. The ruins do not tell us to abandon ambition, they tell us to redefine it. Ambition does not have to mean endless growth. It can mean endurance. It can mean adaptability. It can mean knowing when to expand and when to contract. For thousands of years, humans have measured success by what they build: walls, temples, monuments, cities. But the silent cities ask a harder question. What can you unbuild when it no longer serves you? What can you release without losing yourself? This question is uncomfortable because it challenges identity. Civilizations wrap identity around structure, around place, around permanence. Letting go feels like erasure, but history shows us it is often survival. The people who left silent cities did not walk into nothing, they walked into continuity. They carried knowledge forward, they reshaped culture, they built again differently. Civilization did not end, it evolved, and that may be the most important lesson of all. The end of a city is not the end of a people. The end of a system is not the end of society. The end of certainty is not the end of meaning. The silent cities do not predict our future, they illuminate our choices. They show us what happens when systems become too rigid to change. They show us the cost of waiting for proof that arrives too late. They show us that collapse is not fate but process. A process that can be slowed, redirected, softened if we choose. History does not demand perfection, it demands responsiveness. The civilizations that endured longest were not those that avoided crisis, but those that adapted before crisis became identity. They listened early, they changed quietly, they survived without spectacle. Silence, then, is not merely absence. It is what remains when noise fails. It is the space where reflection becomes possible. It is the pause before reinvention. As we stand at the edge of these vanished cities, we are not being warned by the past, we are being invited by it. Invited to rethink what progress means. Invited to design systems that expect change rather than deny it. Invited to value flexibility as much as strength. The silent cities do not ask us to fear the future, they ask us to respect it, because the future will not look like the past, and it never has. What matters is not whether our cities last forever. Nothing does. What matters is whether our societies can change without breaking, whether our values can evolve without losing compassion. Whether our ambition includes humility. The ruins stand quietly, not accusing us, not warning us, not demanding answers. They simply exist, and in their existence they remind us, civilization is not measured by how long it stands, but by how well it adapts when standing still is no longer possible. If you've stayed with us through this journey into the silent cities, thank you for listening to the quiet history leaves behind. If this documentary made you think, reflect, or see the past and the present differently, please subscribe for more stories that explore the deep patterns of human civilization. And before you go, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Across time and distance, we'd love to know where these ideas are reaching you, because history may be silent, but the conversation continues.